Alrighty, new CPI print for the month of June, and boy oh boy, believe it or not, inflation has still not peaked, even though we were told that inflation was transitory before that it was never going to happen, that we were never going to get sustained above 2%. It was never going to happen. And yet now for months, we've been well above 2%. It's probably, it's over a year at this point, isn't it? I mean, last month we thought it was bad when it printed at 8.6. I forget what the expected number was, probably like 8.4 or something. We beat expectations last month, the month before that, and lo and behold, we managed to do it again. The expectation was for the CPI to print at 8.8%, and that's using the government's own, stilted metrics that way undercounts inflation. And I'll get more on that later. So they still thought that it was going to be higher this month than last month, yet it managed to be even higher than that. They're still wrong. They missed by 0.3%, which may not sound like a lot, but the difference when you're going from 8.6, a jump of 8.6 to 8.8, and in reality went from 8.6 to 9.1, that's a pretty steep rate of acceleration. I mean, that is more than double the rate of acceleration that they were expecting. And so if inflation is increasing at an accelerated pace, when can we expect it to peak? I mean, I guess we should be thankful at this point that it's not officially double-digit inflation. Is that what we should be thanking the Fed for? Oh, thank you, Jerome Powell, for raising 75 basis points. When, had you not done that, maybe we would be at 12% officially. Well, whatever the official number says, not as important as what the real number is, which we get from shadowstats.com. Very important to look at shadow stats because we can't compare modern CPI to historical CPI. If you look at, CPI right now is 9.1%, you say, well, it was worse in the 70s, right? Wrong. It's 17.6% last month, up from 16.8%, I believe, the previous month, according to Shadow Stats, which uses the old historic, more accurate, more proper metric of inflation. So we can actually compare it to historical numbers. You can't compare the CPI of today to the CPI of the 1970s or even of the 1980s, I believe. And so according to Shadow Stats, this month set a 75-year high for inflation. That's higher than the 1970s. So we're not talking about that. What was 75 years ago? What was that? The post-World War II inflation? Is that where we're going? We have to go back to post-World War II? And so even if you take the government's own CPI at face value and say, okay, inflation is 9.1%. Well, the Fed funds rate is hovering down around 2%. So that would put them like 700 basis points below inflation. So the Fed funds rate is 700 basis points negative, 7%. How is the Fed ever going to be taken seriously when it comes to fighting inflation if their current policy is to maintain negative real interest rates? How are you going to get inflation under control when you have negative real interest rates? Negative real interest rates are a way to try and force people to spend money because you're taking away their money if they try and save it. So of course they're going to go out and spend it on whatever goods they can. But despite that, our economy is still tanking. Despite that, we're in a recession. Despite the fact that it harms people to hold on to their money. It's hard to think about all the moving parts in your head. The conventional hydraulic Keynesian analysis tells us we shouldn't have high inflation and a recession at the same time. But we know from history that it is all too possible. And we shouldn't be shocked when we have a Politburo in Washington that thinks that it is their prerogative to play around with the price of money, the supply of money, who should and should not be given more or have or less money. When you do that, you screw with the pricing system. You screw with the market adjusting for supply and demand. And so the result is prices lose their meaning to the extent that prices do not reflect supply and demand, because demand is being screwed with by a Politburo, because supply is being manipulated by regulators and the like. This leads to a situation where things don't make sense, where markets do not work. And they don't work because they're being tampered with, because they're being manipulated, just like they always have been. You know, the government and the Fed and the banks, they get away with a lot of market manipulation, because if they just try and manipulate things on the edge and they don't affect the overall structure of the economy too much, they can get away with it, at least for a while. They do, in time, create imbalances, and that leads to recessions, but as long as they let the recession happen, those imbalances can be corrected, and they can go about, you know, plundering on a small scale once that recession is over. But no. After 2008, they decided no more recessions. We're never giving in. We're going to plunder and take and manipulate prices as much as we want. And now their system is starting to break down. They're slaughtering the goose that laid the golden egg. And the market now is already pricing in a rate cut for Q1 of 2023. And frankly, I wouldn't be shocked if the rate cut came before that. Because just like with all Fed tightening cycles, this one is going to end in a recession, and the Fed doesn't like recessions. So as soon as they get the recession that they are, I don't want to say causing, because the recession needs to happen anyway. Yes, they caused it because of past policies, and it's not just them. I mean, even if in a theoretical, situation where you have no Fed, like let's say the 19th century pre-Lincoln, even though the Fed didn't come about till, World War I, we had something similar to a Fed between the Civil War. But even if you go back to the free banking era, the post-Andrew Jackson America, we had these sorts of bank-driven recessions back then. But they were much more frequent, they were much more mild, or I should say they were much shorter. A lot of times they could be intense, but they would last, maybe a couple of months, and then we could get back on, on with things. And those were not good, but the situation we have now is much worse, where they constantly kick the can down the road, and then eventually we just get this big festering wound that is, gangrenous and is full of pus, and in time it ruptures. And when that happens, it spreads toxin all throughout the body that could, frankly, kill the host, kill the body, that being the U.S. economy, the Western economy, or the global economy. Because the global economy runs through the United States economy. The U.S. has a largely globalized economy. We don't operate as an island. When we are in crisis, the world is in crisis. And so considering that we have 14 years of malinvestment, at the very least, built up in this economy, that we have all of this bad debt that needs to be forgiven, that needs to be written off, there is a great potential that the mild recession that the wizards of smart on Wall Street are now beginning to price in, that the big banks such as Bank of America are now proclaiming, that the Atlanta Fed's models have been predicting, in all likelihood, it will not be such a mild recession, because the recession itself will be enough to destabilize this house of cards and trigger, I don't want to say a contagion effect, but a domino effect. Especially since we have the problem of inflation to deal with. The Fed is not going to end the inflation problem. They will give up, just as so many people have said over the years. People give a lot of crap to a guy like Peter Schiff, but this is something that he's been saying for many, many years, for as long as I can remember, that when the next recession comes and we have the choice between the Fed fighting inflation or the Fed trying to prop up our economic bubble, the Fed is going to choose the bubble in the end. Even if they act like they're going to try and fight inflation, when it comes down to it, they're going to switch sides. And before inflation has been tamed, before inflation has been whipped into shape, they're going to flip, because they know that in order for us to bring inflation back down to normal levels, they're going to have to destroy everything. They're going to have to do so much damage, bring about such a recession that it collapses the whole house of cards. And they can't let that be exposed, because the Fed, they're the ones who have fomented all this. The folks at the Fed have been cultivating this bubble. They do it as a matter of practice. Ever since the Greenspan era, it's been intentional, because Greenspan knew exactly what he was doing. Before that, the bubbles that the Fed created and that the banking system created were unintentional. They didn't think of them as bubbles. But Greenspan did. Greenspan was someone who was very familiar with the Austrian theory of the business cycle, and he believed it to be accurate. And so he used that theory in order to create the very bubbles that it warns against, so that he could then take credit for them. And he would be known as the great maestro. And his three successors have carried on his legacy, even though they don't, I think, fully understand his methods. I don't think that any of them, particularly Powell, are as intelligent as Greenspan. And of course, each of them has been left with a bigger mess, because the mess just kept getting bigger every time that Greenspan kicked the can down the road, because he knew that he'd be gone and retired before he had to deal with any of the consequences. And so it was his first successor, Bernanke, his protege, who had to deal with the '08 crash. And Yellen, Bernanke's successor, she chose just to kick the can down the road. She said, you know what, I see what happened to Bernanke. I'm not going to let that happen on my watch. And she just held rates at zero for her whole career. She tried a little bit, like when, to harm Trump, like to raise, I think, like 0.25% or something, and then backed off and said, no, we're not going to raise anymore. And then eventually she passed the torch to Powell. And Powell, he tried to raise rates some. And then there was the great flip-flop, the great Fed flip-flop back in late 2018. We all talked about it. I talked about it to death. The Christmas Eve massacre. And just like everybody, Powell eventually folded, and he said, you know what, this rate hiking thing, it's overrated. I'm going to quit hiking these rates. And in fact, when the Wu flu came around, Powell decided to cut rates. And so during that time, the federal government ran higher deficits than anyone could ever imagine. America quit working, but the federal government kept spending. It was spending more than it ever had. It was spending so much that it closed the gap in spending and production that was left by the lockdowns. But, of course, Fed money printing and federal government congressional deficit spending cannot replace real production, because they do not produce goods. All they do is consume. All they can do is try and boost the demand side of the economy by creating more claims to goods rather than creating more goods in and of themselves. And so the inevitable result of that was inflation, because these people don't chase a healthy economy. That's not what any of the authorities are trying to push. They're not trying to help our economy produce more goods so that people will have more stuff, so that people will be wealthier, and so that cost of living will go down and standards of living will rise. No, all they're trying to target is this arbitrary number known as gross domestic product. And what is GDP? What is this gross domestic product? Well, it's just spending money. And so that's very easy for them to target, because all they have to do is print money and spend it into existence. And they go out and buy stuff, even if there's no more stuff to buy. Just the act of spending in and of itself makes the GDP rise, and they say, look, we have a great economy. And so that's why we have 17.6 or 17.3% inflation, or officially 9.1% inflation. For once, or I shouldn't say for once, but this past year, or perhaps longer, the inflation number looks scary by itself, even without looking at shadow stats. But when you do look at shadow stats, you see how truly historic this is, because the media wants you to believe that this is the worst inflation since the early 80s, since the 1970s. It's not. It's the worst since the end of World War II. It's worse inflation than has ever occurred in even your parents' lifetimes, assuming that your parents were not alive during World War II or right after World War II. The early baby boomers, they would have been alive during this, and of course the silence and the so-called greatest generation too, but not a lot of them left. I know some, but not a lot of them left. So this isn't quite a 100-year storm, but it's a 75-year storm. And our society was much more resilient back then. People were still coming out of the Depression. They still canned their own food. A lot of them made their own clothes. They could get by. But the modern consumer economy, spelled CONSOOMER, we cannot tolerate this. We're all in for a world of pain. And we'll only know in retrospect, I think, just how bad it will get. Because the crash really hasn't begun yet. Hasn't begun in earnest. Because we haven't had our Lehman moment. We're not seeing, we're seeing a lot, targeted layoffs here and there. We're not seeing mass layoffs. We're not seeing mass bankruptcies. We're not seeing, the housing projects being abandoned, with 2 stories built and then, the 3rd and 4th stories kind of left unfinished and buildings just sort of rotting away. Overgrown entrances to would-be gated communities. All of these sites that, I and others would associate with the '08 crash. We're going to see this back. And it's not going to be just housing, it's going to be everything, because we have an everything bubble this time. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.